It was Senior IT Business Analyst Johnny Aikpitanyi joins me on the world now from Texas in the United States. Thank you so much for joining us at this point.
Yeah, thank you, Theophilus. Thank you for having me.
All right, looking at this situation now, do you think that America's allies will step in to help the U.S. counter China now that President Trump seems to be treating friends and foes alike?
So when you say American allies, I don't think the world needs America just as America needs the world. So those allies, for them to come together, of course, they're going to consider so many things, their economic implications, political implications, long-term development in their places. So once they start considering those things, then they also realize that America remains the superpower. However, so it's going to be, personally, I want them to do what they call a gentleman negotiation with the U.S. instead of just retaliating with higher tariff and all that. So they should play it cool with the U.S., knowing that the current government that they have, they like to flex their muscles and somehow they're prideful of what they do and how they do stuff.
When you say a gentleman agreement, now are you saying that these countries should be subservient under the United States?
So because we already have, I think we have our WTO in place. Sometimes we have those United Nations. So those things can be discussed there. Resolutions can take place there. But like personally for me, the only players I feel for is the African continent, right? Mm-hmm. So, and I would personally say, from the African continent, which should choose not to retaliate, right? Because not retaliating will be a great strategic move, for several reasons. Like I mentioned before, for political reasons and, for economic reasons, long-term development. Take, for example, when you do economic leverage asymmetry, the U.S. is a large, of course, we all know, is a much larger economy than any individual, even African countries, and even the continent as a whole in terms of global trade share. So retaliating could lead to, greater economic harm for African nations than for the U.S., especially if it results in, in loss to access to U.S. market, U.S. investments, and U.S. aids. So the same thing goes even with the European market as well. And also dependency on export and aid. So many African countries, as I'm talking to you right now, export raw materials, maybe agricultural products and textile to the U.S. And maybe under a provincial program, there's a program called AFGA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act. So a trade war could jeopardize those benefits, all things small-scale farmers, manufacturers, and workers. And those are the people we are trying to encourage now, because we are saying we keep Africa green, we be the agricultural place of the whole of the continent. So if we decide to go to retaliate, it might hurt those small farmers as well. So let's just maintain goodwill for long-term investment. So like I said, the U.S. is a major investor and development partner, not just in trade, even to the European nation, in healthcare, in education, in infrastructure, and even in security. So there are other things at stake here. So staying diplomatically cool-headed can pressure investment confidence and geopolitical relations. So let's just focus on, diversifying trade partners. I think that's what the Europeans should even be doing, and African nations now. We can strengthen our inter-African trade, maybe via the international, African continental free trade areas. Then we build a stronger partnership, maybe with China. They can also build with China, the EU, India, and others, just to reduce reliance on the U.S.
But don't you think partnering with these countries you have mentioned will further exacerbate the troubles that the U.S. is having with every other country?
But we're already doing the partnership, although we'll be doing it in lower scale, because everybody likes American products. So because there's one perception about buyers that American products are always good products. So, and that has actually affected even the Chinese. So because the Chinese like to feel and seal their product even before they buy. So sometimes when they seal and feel those American products, because of the standard that is coming with it, so they are quick to buy it. So, but once we start diversifying and trading among ourselves, I don't think even Americans will have issues with it. But believe me, this issue of tariff is more than what my eyes and your eyes can see. Because I know America for who they are, because they're very, very smart, very strategic in their approach. So I know most of this tariff was put in place after the Second World War. So now we have to them, the pandemic is a world war. So they need to revisit those things. But maybe that's why I praise Donald Trump. He's a very bold president. So even those things can be lying with the parliament and nobody is ready to really approach what should be taking place. But he can always take the bull by the horn and say, you know what, we need to address this and address it now. Because that pandemic actually shifted a lot of the trade, even from the US to China, because it helps China's supply chain to be very strong. So right now, they realize that there's a threat, even on the long run. I'm sure that's why he's bringing this tariff. So, but that will be a discussion for another day.
All right, so let's talk about the image of the United States. Now, do you think these trade regulations being made by President Trump could sell the U.S. to foreign investors as an unreliable business partner?
Of course, that's the obvious. Because why the intention is good, but the approach is bad for me. So because you have to study and understudy, then before you can execute in your approach. So I know they've done most of the analysis. So there is an analysis stage and there's an implementation stage. So and before the implementation, there's a process in the supply chain or in the workflow. So what are they doing? And so you don't just come up after your analysis, oh, there's a sign off on this and say, oh, let's begin to implement. You should also consider other things, other key stakeholders. You consider your allies and so many other people. So I know retaliation will also hurt the U.S. export as well, and it's going to higher the prices for the American consumers. That's the truth. But they won't feel it now, but maybe 6 months, 1 year down the road, the American consumers, they're going to feel it.
All right, so China is seeking new trade allies, like we have mentioned earlier, including India, Japan, South Korea, and the EU. But there's a $440 billion in export at stake. Now, does this road look uncertain? And of course, will this deal affect countries? Will this deal with these countries solve China's problem? That's a deal with this country. Will this solve China's problem?
China is maybe we don't want to mention it. China, I think China's economical might and that of US is, I can put it on a 50-50 scale. Okay. So I don't want to tell you, although we have the higher number of billionaires in the US than China, but when you talk of economy scale, I think China and America flex almost the same muscles. So it's when you talk of healthcare security and all that, you can rate America higher than China. So, but having said that, with the BRICS nation in play as well, so China is already trading with Russia, with Iran, with Ethiopia, and the host of others, South Africa, India, that you mentioned, they're already in the BRICS nation. And that on its own is a threat to the American economy and the American currency being the global currency. So these tariff issues that we are hearing now is also an indirect way to address that. But of course, American that cannot just come and say, oh, we want to fight BRICS openly. No. But America can relax the tariff. That's why I say African nations should not retaliate. But they can relax the tariff on African nations and other European nations. But out of China, they really want to flex their muscles because they understand the supply chain, even around the Chinese and Chinese goods, and that is taking over around the world right now. And that is what they're also trying to curb.
All right, so what do you think China should do in the long term? What should be their long-term plan to help its economy maintain the right footing?
For me, I just advise them use diplomatic and legal channels. Okay, that's why thank God we have our sister there, Conjo. That's why we have the WTO dispute resolution, right? So they can continue to push for regional solidarity. So then they leverage global opinion to apply pressure on the U.S. without firing back economically.
All right, so in all of this now, African nations, like we have mentioned, you have said that they shouldn't retaliate with their own form of tariff, but what do you see this as a challenge to African leaders to build their own economy?
So sometimes I just wonder. So I just wonder what's being discussed in the African Union, because this is something that would have been discussed many years ago and solidified many years ago. So sometimes you wonder the kind of discussion that is taking place in there, because, of course, retaliation can escalate and spiral quickly, right? Taking the high road can make Africa look like a responsible global player, which could, win in support with multilateral forums like United Nations and all that. But we just have to come together, begin to trade among ourselves, right? And even this tariff should not even be, whether ECOWAS or among the African states, this tariff should not even be there for them to trade among themselves. And another thing African Union can do to curb all of these menace, take, for example, Nigeria is exporting, or maybe say, okay, Nigeria will take care of cassava, okay? And Ghana, they'll take care of cocoa and all that. And the prices of cassava to Nigeria or cocoa to Nigeria without tariff, okay? But when Ghana decide to send that same cocoa to the US, they can't tell them, oh, maybe it's $10. I'm just giving you a rough figure. They can say it's $10. But even when they sell to Nigeria with $1, but they should make sure Nigerians are not selling that cocoa to the US for $5. Because when that happens, we are spoiling the supply chain on African market. Because that is what is really reducing the African powerhouse. So you see that, because some of those nations are hungry for, export and all of that, so they can use a third party to get their goods from them and begin to ship to the foreign world. But African nations should be able to curb those supply chain. You understand what I'm saying? So if we are to sell to EU among the African nations, whether you are in Congo, whether you are in Nigeria, whether you are in Zambia, if you are to sell to the US, it's going to be the same price as far as coming from the African continent. But once we are selling among ourselves, the price needs to reduce. Then what happens then? The Europeans and the Americans, they are actually forced to buy from us at a defined rate. And that also help the African nations to develop faster.
All right.
Yeah, but what they can do, they can come to Nigeria and say, okay, you know what, give us your cassava for $2. If Nigeria refuse, then they'll go to Ghana, go and buy the Nigeria cassava for 50 cents. And once they buy it, they're going to take it from Ghana for $1. The oil is running at loss because this supply chain is not being curbed.
All right, Senior IT Business Analyst Johnny Aikpitanyi, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.